Those aren't arms, those are legs. I can't apologize to the victims' family members for crimes I never committed.
Without an apology and atonement for these senseless and brutal killings, there can be no redemption.
Stanley Williams was executed by the state of California on December 13, 2005, for 4 murders. A security guard shot execution style in a 7-Eleven. A family killed in their motel room for less than $100. Williams maintained his innocence for 26 years. He co-founded the Crips gang. He wrote children's books warning kids away from that life. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The governor asked him to apologize for the murders. 6 words could have saved his life. "I'm sorry, I did it." He never said them. Some men choose death over confession. The question is whether Williams died for truth or pride. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back to February 1979, to a night shift in Whittier, California. Albert Owens restocked the cigarette rack behind the counter, sliding packs of Marlboros into their slots one by one. February 1979, Whittier, California. The night shift at the 7-Eleven on Whittier Boulevard moved at its own slow pace. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting everything in flat white. The vinyl floor gleamed under the glow. Clean enough to see your reflection if you looked down. He didn't. The refrigerators along the back wall hummed their constant low note, punctuated every few minutes by the electronic chime of the entry door sensor. Someone coming in for milk, someone else for cigarettes and a Coke. A third customer buying nothing, just using the bathroom and leaving. Owens rang up what needed ringing, made change, counted bills twice to be sure. The register drawer opened and closed with a mechanical snap that marked time better than any clock. Each transaction took less than a minute. Most customers didn't say much beyond the price and thank you. Cool air drifted from the refrigerated section every time someone opened a door beer, soda. The dairy case stocked with milk and eggs. Owens felt it on his arms when he walked past to check the backstock. His hands moved across the smooth counter surface between customers, wiping it down with a rag that smelled faintly of bleach. The work was routine, predictable, the kind of job where muscle memory does most of the thinking. Straighten the candy display. Face the chips so the labels point forward. Check the coffee pot. Make sure it's full enough for the next wave. This is what we know about Albert Owens. He worked the night shift. He showed up. He did the work in front of him. History keeps almost nothing else. No record of what he thought about while he restocked shelves. No documentation of his plans past this shift. The archive is thin not because his life didn't matter, but because nobody thought to write it down before it was too late. The ordinariness was the point. 1,000 nights like this one had come before. The hum of refrigerators. The chime of the door. The snap of the register. Routine builds a kind of trust. Tonight will be like last night, and tomorrow night will be like tonight. That trust is what makes people show up to work. It's what makes a night shift feel safe enough to work alone. Around 11 o'clock. Owens straightened the magazine rack near the front window. Outside, Whittier Boulevard was quiet. Occasional headlights swept past, but most of the city was already asleep or getting there. A few storefronts down the block still had their lights on, a gas station, maybe a diner. Inside the store, everything was exactly where it should be. Cigarettes aligned, register balanced, coffee brewing for the late shift customers who'd trickle in before dawn. But elsewhere in California that night, other forces were already in motion, decisions being made, distances being crossed. 200 miles south in Los Angeles. Stanley Williams was awake too. Years before the night in Whittier, Stanley Williams walked the Santa Monica boardwalk in bright daylight. Mid-1970s. The beach stretched out in both directions, sunlight reflecting off the Pacific. Tourists and bodybuilders mixing on the wide concrete path. Williams was lifting then serious weight, serious size. His arms had earned attention before, but not like what happened that afternoon. Arnold Schwarzenegger, bodybuilder and future governor of California, crossed paths with Williams on the Santa Monica boardwalk in the mid-1970s, years before clemency and execution became his decision to make. Schwarzenegger was walking the opposite direction when he stopped, looked at Williams' arms, and pointed. "Those aren't arms. Those are legs." Williams grinned. The compliment from one of the most famous bodybuilders in the world landed like a trophy he could carry around for the rest of his life. He'd tell the story for 30 years at the gym, in the yard, in interviews, the moment when Schwarzenegger himself acknowledged the work. Neither man knew the calendar. Neither knew that decades later, one would sit in Sacramento with a pen and a clemency petition, and the other would sit on death row waiting for an answer. What looks like a compliment on a sunny boardwalk becomes something else entirely when time runs its full course. Irony lives in time. What seems simple in one decade becomes unbearable in another. A casual exchange between two men who built their bodies into weapons, one for movies and politics, one for survival and violence, would circle back around until the same hand that pointed at Williams' arms would sign the denial that ended his life. Forward in time now. March 10th, 1979. Night. The Yang family husband, wife, daughter owned and operated the Brookhaven Motel on Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles, a property that required 6 deadbolts to feel safe. They knew where they lived. Vermont Avenue wasn't the safest street in the city, and running a motel meant strangers came and went at all hours. So they'd installed 6 locks on their door. 6 separate deadbolts that needed 6 separate keys. That night, they went through the routine. First lock, second lock, third, fourth, fifth. Each one a small piece of security. Each one a calculation that enough metal between them and the outside world would be enough. The 6th lock turned last, the sound of it sliding into place audible in the quiet room. Metal on metal. The sound of precaution. They went to bed. 4 hours later, someone would kick through that door with enough force to rip the hinges from the frame. All 6 deadbolts would still be turned. Still locked tight. Still doing exactly what they were designed to do. It wouldn't matter. The door would come off in pieces, and the locks would come with it, torn from wood that couldn't hold against that much violence. 6 locks. 6 promises of safety. Not one of them kept. Before the door came off its hinges. Before the 6 locks failed. Stanley Williams was a 6-year-old boy stepping off a bus in Los Angeles. Born 1953 in Louisiana. Sometime around 1959 or 1960, he and his mother arrived in South Central. Williams' mother worked multiple jobs in South Central Los Angeles after moving from Louisiana, raising her son alone without a father present. The poverty was immediate, cramped apartments, noise through thin walls, streets where you learned fast who to avoid and who to stand next to. But the teachers noticed something. Friends noticed it too. Williams had a gift for language, perfect diction, when other kids his age still fumbled basic sentences, spelling words they couldn't touch, recalling details they'd already forgotten. He could think 3 steps ahead in conversation. Pick apart an argument. Articulate what others felt but couldn't name. Intelligence like that should have opened doors, should have meant scholarships, opportunities, a way out. It didn't. South Central in the 1960s didn't have many ladders for a black kid with no father and a mother working doubles just to keep them lights on. The schools were overcrowded, under-resourced, built more for containment than cultivation. So the intelligence that should have been an advantage became something else, a tool that needed a different application. The streets provided one. Williams started fighting young. Neighborhood scraps at first. Someone talks, someone swings, someone wins. He won more than he lost. Then older kids wanted to test him. Then adults started watching. What does a gifted mind do when every door is closed except the one that leads to fists? It walks through. By age 10. Williams wasn't just fighting for survival or reputation. He was fighting because he was good at it. Because people respected what they saw. Because violence was the only currency that bought him anything resembling power. His body grew into the work. Shoulders widening, arms thickening. The kind of physical presence that made people step back before words were even exchanged. By 12, the fights had an audience. Grown men formed circles in alleys and empty lots, cash changing hands, betting on whether the kid could take down opponents twice his size. He could. The violence wasn't random anymore. It was structured, transactional, almost professional. A child breaking bones, while adults made money off the outcome. This is what happens when intelligence has nowhere legitimate to go. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't wait patiently for society to change its mind. It finds the path that's open, even if that path leads somewhere no 12-year-old should ever walk. Williams was 12 years old with a reputation, with an audience, with grown men who saw profit in his fists. The fights were currency. The fights were survival. The fights were the beginning of something much larger. Though nobody watching those street circles could have predicted how far it would go. He was only getting started. At 16, Stanley Williams stole a car and got caught. The arrest in 1969 bought him 2 years inside Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall. 2 years that would shape what came next in ways the court never intended. Los Padrinos had a weight room. Williams found it and stayed there. Posters of Sergio Oliva taped to the walls. Arnold Schwarzenegger mid-competition. Bodies built into monuments of discipline and power. The iron became obsession. Bench press. Squats. Curls. Hours every day. Adding weight. Adding size. Sculpting the frame that would carry him through whatever waited outside. The routine was relentless. Every rep another layer of armor. Every set another warning to anyone who'd test him later. By the time he walked out in 1971, his waist measured 26 inches and his arms had grown into the kind of mass that Schwarzenegger had once compared to legs. The nickname finally made full sense. The body was weapon and advertisement both. It said what words couldn't. Don't test this. Don't push. Don't assume you know how this ends. Incarceration was supposed to break him. Instead, it forged him into something harder, more focused, more dangerous than what walked in. Out in 1971, Williams met Raymond Washington. Ray Washington, Crips co-founder alongside Williams, brought his own crew and reputation to the 1971 merger that created the gang, without ceremony or documentation. Two groups of young men in South Central, both running their own blocks, both looking for something larger than individual survival. They crossed paths the way water finds water. No formal introduction, no negotiation of terms, no lawyers or contracts or handshake deals. Just recognition that combining forces made more sense than competing for the same limited territory and resources. Two leaders, two sets of followers, no charter written, No hierarchy drawn on paper. No founding meeting where someone stood up and announced the birth of a gang. It just became the Crips. The name came from somewhere. Accounts differ on the origin. Stories conflict. But the name stuck and spread faster than anyone could have predicted. What started as two groups on adjacent corners in South Central grew block by block. Organically. Inevitably. Like water finding every available crack in the pavement. There was no plan. No one sat down with a blueprint for building the most recognized street gang on earth. No manifesto. No mission statement. No organizational chart mapping who answered to whom. It happened because the conditions were right. Poverty, limited opportunities, police tension, territorial instincts, young men with intelligence and violence, and nowhere legitimate to channel either. The Crips weren't designed. They emerged. No one wrote a charter. No meeting announced the birth. Two groups merged on a street corner in South Central, and it became the Crips, the structure that would eventually span cities, that would be studied by criminologists and law enforcement for decades, that would become synonymous with gang violence in America. It started with nothing but proximity and inevitability. Two men, two crews, one name that would outlive them both. A leather jacket became a death sentence in 1972 at the Hollywood Palladium. The gang that formed without planning or hierarchy was about to get its national debut not through anything the founders did, but through what someone else did in their name. Robert Ballou, high school student and son of an attorney, was beaten to death at the Hollywood Palladium in 1972 for his leather jacket in a murder that carried the Crips' name nationwide. Ballou was 17, wearing a jacket worth more than a beating but less than a life. The fight happened inside the venue, escalated fast, ended with Ballou on the ground and the jacket gone. The beating didn't stop when he fell. By the time it was over, the jacket wasn't the point anymore. Stanley Williams and Raymond Washington weren't there. They didn't order it, didn't plan it, didn't even know it was happening until after. But the people who killed Ballou called themselves Crips, and that was enough. The name went coast to coast. Newspapers picked it up. Law enforcement started tracking it. One of the founders would later reflect on the moment. See, the murder meant one thing for certain. They're going to say we're the forefront. Notoriety doesn't require presence. The Crips became a national name based on a murder their co-founders had no part in. The structure they never formally created was now being blamed for violence they hadn't committed. But that's how names work once attached. They carry everything forward, whether the founders control it or not. Around 1975, Williams took a job as a youth counselor in South Central. The work was simple. Supervise kids in group homes. Help them navigate school. Keep them out of trouble. The other counselors trusted him. He was good at it, by all accounts. Patient. Articulate. Able to connect with teenagers who wouldn't listen to most adults. He enjoyed the work. Showed up consistently. Did what was asked. Earned respect from colleagues who had no idea what else he was doing. Because at night, Williams led the same kids he counseled by day into the gang life he'd helped create. He wasn't lying to the counselors or the kids. Both versions were real. The man who could talk a teenager out of a bad decision in the afternoon could recruit that same teenager into the Crips by evening. Two truths in one body, neither counterfeit. Both fully operational. This is what contradiction looks like when it's sincere. Not hypocrisy. Not deception. Just a man who genuinely believed he could help kids during work hours and build a gang that endangered those same kids. After hours. The gap between those two realities never seemed to trouble him. Or if it did, no record shows it. In 1976, Williams was sitting on his porch when the shooting started. Not a fight he'd picked, not violence he'd planned, just bullets finding him on an ordinary evening. Rival gangs settling a score the way scores got settled. He survived. Others wouldn't. The Pyrus gang shot Williams twice in the legs on that youth home porch. Both legs. The bullets tore through muscle and bone, dropping him where he stood. The man who'd built himself through iron and discipline, who'd turned his body into both weapon and shield, was suddenly immobile. Temporary paralysis. The doctors at King Hospital would later confirm it wouldn't be permanent, but in those first hours, Williams couldn't move from the waist down. The irony was surgical. Everything Williams had constructed, the size, the strength, the physical presence that made people step back before he said a word, rendered useless by two pieces of metal traveling faster than thought. The body that was supposed to protect him had failed at the...
Those aren't arms, those are legs.
King Hospital, 1976. 2 casts, both legs. Wheelchair first, and then crutches when he could bear weight. A friend of Williams witnessed his struggle through paralysis and PCP addiction in the late 1970s, holding him through breakdowns while trying to save him from self-destruction. The friend would later recall Williams trying to mob through hospital hallways on crutches. 2 casts, slowing nothing, refusing to stay still even when his body demanded it. The will wouldn't quit. The stubbornness that had carried him through street fights since age 12 wasn't going to surrender to bullets or doctor's orders. But recovery doesn't care about will. The healing took time, and pain filled every hour of it. Someone offered PCP first for the pain, just to take the edge off, just to make the hours bearable. Then it became more than pain management. Then it became its own need. A friend held Williams crying one night. The same man who'd broken bones since childhood, now broken himself, trying to save him from the negative stuff. As the friend would later describe it, the drugs, the spiral, the version of Williams that was slipping away beneath the addiction. But addiction doesn't respond to friendship any more than bullets respond to muscle. The PCP changed him. Not immediately, not all at once, but across the months and years that followed, something shifted. The man who walked away from the shooting wasn't the same man who'd been shot. The violence he'd always carried became less calculated, more chaotic. The discipline that had marked his rise fractured under the weight of chemical need. 3 years passed. The legs healed. The crutches disappeared. But the damage ran deeper than bone. February 1979. A car pulled off the road in Whittier. 4 men inside, low on gas, needing money. One of them was Stanley Williams. The others would later be named in court. 3 more men whose decisions that night would define the rest of their lives. Albert Owens was still behind the counter at the 7-Eleven, finishing his shift, unaware that 4 men had just decided his store looked like the answer to their problem. The car pulled into the 7-Eleven lot in Whittier. February 1979. Fluorescent light spilling onto asphalt. 4 men, low on gas, needing money. What happened next is documented in court records, though the full truth died with the only person who could have confirmed or denied every detail. According to court testimony, Tony Bam Sims was one of 3 accomplices with Williams during the February 1979 7-Eleven robbery and murder of Albert Owens. Alfred Blackie Coward was one of 3 accomplices with Williams during the February 1979 7-Eleven robbery and murder of Albert Owens. Court records state that Sims and Coward went into the store first. They came back out. Too many people inside, they said. Too many potential problems. Then, according to testimony that Williams would dispute until the day of his execution. He allegedly made a statement, "I'll show you how to do it and not leave witnesses." Those words, if they were spoken, would follow Williams for 30 years. He denied saying them, denied it at trial, denied it through decades of appeals, denied it in his final statements before the state of California ended his life. The only people who could confirm whether those words were actually spoken were the 3 men in that car, and their accounts served their own interests. Truth and testimony don't always occupy the same space. What is documented, Williams went into the 7-Eleven. Albert Owens was behind the counter, finishing his shift. The same routine that had carried him through countless nights before. Williams ordered him into the back room, ordered him to lie down. Owens complied, did exactly what he was told, lay down, caused no trouble, gave no resistance. Compliance is supposed to be the safest choice when facing someone with a weapon. Do what they say. Let them take what they want. Survive the moment and call the police after they leave. One shotgun blast. Execution style. Owens was killed on the floor of the back room in the store, where he'd shown up to work a shift that should have ended with him going home. This is what the court record shows. This is what the jury heard, weighed, and used to convict. Whether every detail happened exactly as testimony described, whether the statement about witnesses was ever actually spoken. These questions matter deeply to the question of who Williams was and whether redemption can exist without confession. But they don't change what is certain. Albert Owens went to work and never came home. 4 weeks passed. February became March, then deeper into March. No arrest, no knock on the door, no immediate justice for Albert Owens or his family. Williams and the 3 other men walked free through those weeks, going about their lives while Owens was gone from his. The hardest part to sit with is the silence that follows violence. The space between a murder and an arrest. The time when the person responsible is still out there, still moving, still breathing, while the victim is not. In those 4 weeks between murders, Stanley Williams lifted weights in plain sight, walked his neighborhood, lived visibly. No flight, no change in behavior. The normalcy itself was unsettling not because it proved innocence or guilt, but because it showed a man who either had nothing to hide or nothing to fear from hiding. Late February through early March 1979. Williams continued his routines. The gym, the streets, visible to everyone who knew him, available to anyone who might have been looking. Ordinary days stacking between one death and the next. Time passing the way it always does when nobody's counting yet. Then, March 11th, 1979, 5 a.m. Someone kicked through the door at the Brookhaven Motel on Vermont Avenue. The same door the Yang family had secured with 6 separate deadbolts the night before. The same precautions they'd taken every night. The calculation that metal and locks would be enough. All 6 deadbolts ripped from the frame. The door came off its hinges. 6 locks, calculated and installed with care. And the door came down anyway. Not because the locks failed to work, but because no lock can hold when the entire door frame tears away from the wall. The Yang family husband, wife, daughter were murdered inside. The people who broke in took $50 to $100. That was the sum total of what 3 lives bought that morning. Less than the cost of the door they'd destroyed to get it. Court records name Stanley Williams as responsible for these murders. The prosecution built its case, presented its evidence, convinced a jury beyond reasonable doubt. But the forensic evidence told a more complicated story, one that would matter deeply to anyone trying to understand whether Williams was guilty, or whether the system convicted the wrong man for the right reasons. A blood-stained shoe print was found at the scene. It didn't match Williams' shoes. Shotgun shells recovered from the Brookhaven motel didn't match the gun that killed Albert Owens, the gun that would be traced to Williams. The physical evidence that should have tied him definitively to the scene pointed elsewhere, or pointed nowhere, or pointed to questions that a guilty verdict would never fully answer. Williams denied involvement in the Yang murders until the day California executed him. Denied it with the same consistency he denied making the statement about witnesses at the 7-Eleven. Whether that denial was truth or strategy, innocence or refusal to confess. These questions don't have answers anymore. The only people who could settle them are dead. The Yang family lay behind the destroyed door for 4 days before someone called police. March 11th to March 15th. 4 days of silence in a motel on Vermont Avenue while Los Angeles kept moving. While people drove past on their way to work. While the city continued like nothing had happened. Because for everyone except the Yang family, nothing had. The arrest would finally come. March 15th, 1979. The phone rang at the police station and someone gave them Stanley Williams' name, an address, and the location of a shotgun. The Yang family had been dead for 4 days. Now the police had a suspect, James Garrett, an informant connected to Williams' circle, provided police with Williams' name and the location of the shotgun used in the Brookhaven murders, leading to Williams' March 15th, 1979 arrest. Garrett walked into a police station and laid it all out: names, addresses, evidence. The neighborhood would call him a snitch for years. Federal authorities moved Garrett from state to state for his protection, relocating him multiple times to keep him alive. Whatever deal he made, it required running. Williams was arrested that same day. The shotgun was recovered where Garrett said it would be. The machine that had been set in motion with Albert Owens in February and the Yang family in March now had its target locked. 2 years later, in 1981, Stanley Williams sat in a Los Angeles courtroom while prosecutors built their case. They had witnesses, Garrett and others, who testified about what Williams allegedly said and did. They had the shotgun. They had a timeline. But they also had something else, something that required no forensic testing or expert testimony. They had Williams' body. Bodybuilding made him famous. In court, those same muscles made him guilty. The prosecution argued that only someone as physically powerful as Stanley Williams could have kicked through the Brookhaven motel door with 6 deadbolts. Look at him, they said. 26-inch waist, arms so large Arnold Schwarzenegger had once called them legs. 500 pounds on the bench press. Who else could destroy a reinforced door like that? The same strength that had drawn crowds on the Santa Monica boardwalk, the same physique that had intimidated rivals and impressed strangers, now sat in a courtroom as evidence of guilt. Every inch of muscle became proof of capability. Every hour spent in a weight room became preparation for murder. Williams spoke from the stand. My reputation made me fit the bill, he said, his voice steady. I was the perfect target. The defense presented their case. No fingerprints at the Brookhaven motel matched Williams. The bloody shoe print didn't match his shoes. The shotgun shells recovered at the scene didn't match the shotgun Garrett had led police to. Williams denied involvement in the Yang murders, denied it in court, denied it through appeals, denied it until the day he died. But the prosecution had a story that made sense to the jury. A Crips co-founder. A man built like a weapon. A gang leader with a reputation for violence. Witnesses who said he did it. A shotgun in his possession. Strength that could kick through 6 locks. The jury deliberated. They returned with their verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts. Albert Owens. Yen I Yang, Tsai Shai Yang, Yi Chen Lin. 4 murders. The judge handed down the sentence shortly after death. The bus to San Quentin State Prison would leave in 2 weeks, carrying Stanley Williams to death row. 2 people were willing to swear under oath that Stanley Williams was somewhere else the night of the murders. Beverly McGovern testified at Williams' 1981 trial that he was with her during one of the nights when the murders occurred. Providing an alibi the jury did not believe. She sat in the witness box and stated it plainly. He was with her. She said it under penalty of perjury. Williams' stepfather, Fred, testified as an alibi witness at the 1981 trial. But like most family alibi testimony, the jury rejected his account without detailed explanation. He swore Williams was elsewhere. He looked the jury in the eye and said it. The jury didn't believe either of them. No court record explains why in detail. No transcript captures the moment the jury decided these witnesses were lying or mistaken. Just that they didn't believe them. That's how most family alibis end in courtrooms. Not with proof they're false, but with a jury's silent verdict that they don't matter. The defense had witnesses willing to testify under oath. The prosecution had Garrett and the shotgun and Williams' reputation. The jury weighed both and chose the story that fit. 2 weeks after the guilty verdict, the bus left Los Angeles for San Quentin State Prison. Stanley Williams sat in restraints, 28 years old, sentenced to death. The bus rolled north on Interstate 5 past farmland and small towns, carrying him toward Condemned Row. 28 years old. He had lived that long childhood in Louisiana, teenage years in South Central, the Crips, the violence, the bodybuilding, the murders, or the frame-up, depending on who you believed. 24 years ahead, nearly doubling a life already lived. If Williams lived to see his execution, he would spend more time waiting to die than he had spent living free. More years on death row than he'd spent building the reputation that brought him there. San Quentin State Prison sits on the edge of San Francisco Bay. The condemned block is a separate unit, East Block, where California keeps the men it sentences to death. Williams arrived in 1981 and was assigned a cell 6 feet by 9 feet, a bunk, a toilet, bars. The first 7 years. Nothing changed. From 1981 to 1988, Stanley Williams remained the man who had walked into that courtroom. The violence that had defined him in South Central followed him to death row. The reputation, Crips co-founder, the man too strong to ignore, stayed intact. Other inmates knew who he was. Guards knew who he was. Prison didn't soften him. It didn't break him. It didn't transform him. For 7 years, he lifted weights in the yard when they let him out. He maintained the body that had once drawn crowds and later convicted him. He lived by the same code he'd carried from the streets. From 1981 to 1988, the first 7 years on San Quentin's death row. Prison didn't change Stanley Williams at all. The violence, the reputation, the man, all intact. What did unchanged look like? It looked like the San Quentin prison yard in 1981, which operated on the same principle Williams had followed his entire life. Any indication of weakness, you get devoured. The yard was where condemned men spent their few hours outside their cells each week. Concrete underfoot, chain link fences overhead, razor wire catching the light. Guards watched from towers. Inmates watched each other. From 1981 to 1988, Williams lived in constant conflict. Other inmates tested him. Guards confronted him. The reputation that had defined him in South Central followed him here, and on death row, it served the same purpose. Survival. Show weakness. Someone moves on you. Show strength. They keep their distance. He lifted weights in the yard when allowed. The body that had once drawn crowds on the Santa Monica boardwalk, the muscles that had helped convict him in court, now functioned as they always had. Armor. 500 pounds on the bench press. Arms that looked like legs. A frame that said, "Do not test this." The logic made sense for 7 years. Build the body so nobody can touch you. Maintain the reputation so nobody tries. It was the same calculation he'd made at 16 in Los Angeles. At 21, when the Crips spread across the city. At 28, when the jury convicted him. Violence as deterrent. Strength as shield. Then, around 1987, Lil Fee, a younger death row inmate sentenced to San Quentin in 1986, engaged in a power struggle with Williams that culminated in stabbing him and inadvertently forcing both men into years of solitary confinement. Fee decided the yard wasn't big enough for both of them. 2 men with death sentences fighting over who controlled the space where they'd both wait to die. The tension escalated over weeks. Words in the yard. Looks that lasted too long. The kind of buildup that everyone around them could see coming. Then Fee made his move. The blade went in. Williams went down. Guards rushed in, separated them, locked them both down. Both men were sent to solitary confinement, the hole, as inmates called it. A cell even smaller than the one on Condemned Row. No yard time. No contact with other prisoners. 23 hours a day alone. 1 hour in a concrete exercise pen if they were lucky. Here was the irony. Lil Fee's attempt to kill Williams may have inadvertently saved him. Solitary removed Williams from the yard where the cycle would have continued retaliation. Counter-retaliation. Violence breeding more violence until someone ended up dead for real. Execution or murder. The method didn't matter. On death row, the distinction blurred. Fee had tried to eliminate a rival. Instead, he put Williams in the only room where he couldn't kill back, where the reputation didn't matter because there was no audience, where strength had no function because there was no one to fight. The solitary confinement door closed behind Stanley Williams in 1987. It would stay closed for 6 years. 6 years alone. No yard, no fights, no audience, just silence. The silence was the first thing. The lock turned behind Stanley Williams in 1987, and for 6 years the only thing to look at was himself. Solitary confinement at San Quentin meant a cell smaller than the one on Condemned Row. 6 feet by 9 feet. A concrete box with a steel door. A slot for food trays. A toilet. A bunk. No television. No radio. No books at first. 23 hours a day in that room. 1 hour in a concrete exercise pen if the guards allowed it. Alone. The yard violence stopped because there was no yard. The reputation didn't matter because there was no audience. The body he'd built served no function because there was no one.
He would tell me when we were 14, 15, I'm gonna be like Al Capone.
Just Williams and the walls and the decades of choices that had led him there. 6 years is 2,190 days. 2,190 mornings waking up to the same walls, the same silence, the same man in the mirror. Before I reveal what 6 years of silence did to the Crips co-founder, comment A or B. A equals people can truly change. B equals redemption doesn't erase the past. Add one short reason. Note what follows is based on Williams' documented statements after leaving solitary. Those specific moments are recreated for storytelling. What happened in those 6 years remains largely undocumented. No forensics. No new evidence. No breakthrough from outside. Just one man in one room, with the weight of 4 murders committed or framed, depending on who you believed, and a gang that had spread across Los Angeles, leaving thousands dead or imprisoned. Sources who knew Williams later would say, "You doing 6 years in the hole, that's a lot to think about." Williams found God in solitary. He renounced the Crips. He came to a conclusion that would define the rest of his life. Everything he had built the gang, the reputation. The violence was for nothing. The Crips co-founder, the man who had helped create one of the most notorious street gangs in American history, decided in a concrete box that it had all been a waste. The wars over territory, the murders, the power structure that had imprisoned or killed a generation of young black men in Los Angeles. Pointless. No documentation exists of the exact moments when these realizations struck. No journal entries. No letters describing the precise day or hour when his mind shifted. Only what walked out of solitary in 1993, a different man, speaking different words, claiming a different purpose. Transformation is easy to claim and hard to prove. Prison conversions are common. Death row inmates find God regularly, especially when execution dates approach. The skepticism Williams would face was predictable, but he walked out of solitary in 1993 and immediately started writing children's books for kids who couldn't read yet, warning them away from gangs, anti-violence messages aimed at the next generation. Stanley Williams walked out of solitary in 1993, transformed, renounced, reborn. Immediately, he started writing children's books for kids who couldn't read yet, warning them away from the life he'd created. Writing required a partner. Bara Becknell, journalist and author, researched the Crips extensively before meeting Williams in 1993 and collaborating with him on an 8-book anti-gang series for children. She walked into the San Quentin visiting room in 1993, carrying research she'd gathered door to door through South Central. Every story about the Crips she could find before meeting the man who co-founded them. They met through a glass partition. Williams on one side, death row inmate number A-29300. Becknell on the other, a journalist who had spent months learning what the Crips had done to Los Angeles. They began working together. 8 books for children, kindergarten through 6th grade. Gangs and weapons. Gangs and self-esteem. Gangs and abuse of power. A reverse instruction manual teaching kids how to avoid everything Williams had once embodied. The titles made the intent clear. Here is what destroys you. Here is how to walk away. Experts estimated that hundreds, maybe thousands of young people had died because of the gang Williams co-founded. The violence that started with Raymond Washington and Williams in the early 1970s had spread across Los Angeles and beyond, multiplying through decades, leaving bodies and prison sentences in its wake. The books couldn't bring anyone back. They tried to save those who remained. The transformation looked genuine to some, calculated to others. Prison conversions are easy to claim, hard to measure. How do you quantify changed intentions against documented deaths? Then in the early 2000s, Stanley Williams, Crips co-founder, convicted murderer, death row inmate, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. From death row to Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Both sentences true, neither canceling the other. The nomination came from activists and educators who believed the children's books and anti-gang advocacy represented real change. The man who had helped create one of America's most violent street gangs was now being considered for the world's most prestigious Peace Award. In 2004, Williams published his memoir, Blue Rage, Black Redemption. The same year, a film called Redemption starred Jamie Foxx as Williams, telling the story of transformation from gang founder to anti-violence advocate. The narrative was reaching mainstream America. Redemption is possible, even from death row, even after decades of violence. Meanwhile, Arnold Schwarzenegger had become governor of California. The bodybuilder who had once complimented Williams' arms on the Santa Monica boardwalk, those aren't arms, those are legs, now held the sole power to grant or deny clemency. The man who had admired Williams' physique in bright daylight decades ago would decide whether Williams lived or died. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. But it was real. By autumn 2005, every legal appeal had been exhausted. The California Supreme Court had denied review. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals had ruled. The United States Supreme Court had declined to hear the case. The courts were done deciding. 24 years on death row, exactly the span Williams had lived before entering San Quentin in 1981. The timeline he'd been given in solitary had run its course. The appeals that stretched through the 1990s and into the 2000s had reached their end. By autumn 2005, every appeal had been exhausted. The courts were done. One person remained with the power to stop the execution: Arnold Schwarzenegger, governor of California. The courts finished their work. The last court filing came back rejected in fall 2005. 24 years of legal arguments, and the final answer was the same as the first number. The appeals had started in 1981, immediately after the death sentence. State courts. First, California Superior Court, California Court of Appeal, California Supreme Court. Then federal courts. United States District Court, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, United States Supreme Court. Habeas corpus petitions. Ineffective assistance of counsel claims. Constitutional violations. Evidence suppression. Jury instruction errors. Every legal argument Williams's attorneys could construct, they filed. Every level of the system reviewed the case. Trial transcripts, thousands of pages long. Witness testimony from 1981. The shotgun. James Garrett's statements. The alibi witnesses the jury didn't believe. The forensic evidence that didn't match shoe prints. Shotgun shells. Williams' denial of the Yang murders from arrest through execution date. The courts reviewed it all, multiple times, at multiple levels. The answer kept coming back the same. The conviction stands. The sentence stands. The execution date stands. For 24 years, there was always one more motion to file, one more argument to make, one more court to petition. Legal strategy required exhausting every avenue before clemency became the final option. As long as appeals remained, hope remained. Technical, procedural, narrow, hope. But hope nonetheless. Then fall 2005 arrived, and there were no more courts to ask. The legal system was finished with Stanley Williams. 24 years of appeals, 8,760 days, and not one court said yes. The machinery that had stretched across 2.5 decades, that had involved dozens of attorneys and hundreds of judges and thousands of pages of legal briefs, narrowed suddenly to one office in Sacramento. One man, one decision. From institutions designed to distribute judgment across many people to a single person with sole discretionary power. Clemency operates differently than appeals. Courts examine law procedure, evidence standards, constitutional rights. Was the trial fair? Was the evidence sufficient? Were the defendant's rights protected? The legal questions. Clemency examines something else. Not whether the conviction was lawful, but whether mercy is appropriate. Not whether the trial followed proper procedure, but whether the sentence should be carried out. It's the last valve in the system, the final check on irreversible punishment. The governor of California holds that power. In fall 2005, that was Arnold Schwarzenegger. The question was no longer legal guilt. Evidence. Procedure. The courts had answered those questions definitively. The question became moral, whether a person who created violence could genuinely transform. Whether redemption was real or performance. Whether the children's books and the Nobel Peace Prize nomination represented authentic change or calculated self-preservation. Whether 24 years on death row, 6 of them in solitary confinement, had produced a different man. Whether people can change at all. The courts were done. The question moved from law to something else. Not whether Stanley Williams was guilty, but whether people can change at all. That question belonged to one person now. Answering that question required reaching one person with one message before time ran out. Bara Becknell picked up the phone in late 2005 and called Mervyn Dimely, California's lieutenant governor and Black Caucus leader, who responded to her call and helped organize the clemency campaign for Williams in late 2005. The beginning of a clemency effort with weeks to build it. Dimely's office responded immediately. Phone trees activated. Churches across California opened their doors for organizing meetings. Advocates who had followed Williams' transformation work started making calls to community leaders, to activists, to anyone who might help carry the message to Sacramento. The execution date was set December 13th, 2005. Less than a month away. Clemency campaigns usually take months to organize. Years, ideally. This one had weeks. Governor Schwarzenegger agreed to hear both sides. A clemency hearing would convene. Williams' supporters and the prosecution would present their cases. Then Schwarzenegger would decide. The question went public in its simplest form. Can people change? Not the legal complexities. Not the forensic evidence that didn't match or the alibi witnesses the jury rejected. Not the constitutional arguments or the appellate procedural history. Just can a person who created violence genuinely transform? Can redemption be real? The rally started. Los Angeles, Sacramento, San Francisco. Thousands of people gathering with signs, chanting, marching. Celebrities joined Snoop Dogg, who had distanced himself from gang life partly because of Williams' anti-gang advocacy. Jesse Jackson. Civil rights leaders who saw Williams' children's books as proof of authentic change. A supporter watching the crowds gather had a realization. This man is well loved. Thousands rallied publicly for Stanley Williams, a level of support revealing he'd become something beyond the gang founder, beyond the convicted killer. He had become a symbol. Hope is a dangerous thing on death row. It can carry you through decades, or it can crush you when it fails. Williams had spent 24 years watching execution dates get postponed, appeals get filed, courts issue stays. Now, with weeks left, hope arrived in the form of crowds and celebrities and public pressure. The clemency campaign built momentum. News coverage every day. Editorials debating whether transformation matters. Whether the children's books counted as restitution. Whether the Nobel Peace Prize nominations meant anything. Advocates argued that executing a man who had genuinely changed served no purpose that Williams alive. Speaking against gangs saved more lives than Williams dead. The argument sounded compelling to thousands. Churches preached about redemption. Activists spoke about systemic racism in the death penalty. Community leaders pointed to the hundreds, maybe thousands of young people Williams's books had reached. Schwarzenegger listened. The hearing was scheduled. Both sides would present their cases. But while thousands rallied for redemption, while celebrities spoke and churches organized and advocates built their case for mercy, another group had been waiting to speak. The families of Albert Owens and the Yangs. They had been waiting 26 years to be asked what they thought. The clemency campaign built momentum. Celebrities, advocates, thousands in the streets, asking Schwarzenegger to grant mercy. But the other side had been waiting a long time to be asked. 26 years. They got their chance to speak. Early December 2005. The press conferences and hearings began. Both sides finally invited to speak. 26 years of silence breaking into argument. The victims' families spoke about Albert Owens working a night shift, doing everything the gunman asked, lying face down before the shotgun blast. They spoke about the Yang family murdered in their motel room for less than $100. 26 years of grief, of living with loss while the man convicted wrote books and received praise. The advocates for Williams spoke about transformation. 8 children's books warning kids away from gangs. Thousands of young people reached. Nobel Peace Prize nominations. A man who had renounced the gang he co-founded and dedicated the rest of his life to preventing others from following his path. The debate intensified. Opponents didn't dispute that the books were good, they disputed the timing. Was death row transformation genuine redemption, or strategic manipulation for clemency? When did the change happen? In 1993, after solitary, or in 2005, when the execution date was set. Nobody could prove inner motives. Both sides made valid points. Neither side was lying. But underneath the debate, a simpler question surfaced. Not did he change, but will he apologize? Williams had defined redemption himself in his writing. The first step was acknowledging all faults, taking full responsibility for harm caused. He had done that partially. He admitted co-founding the Crips. He admitted the damage that gang had done. He admitted leading young people into violence, into prison, into early graves. He called it his greatest regret. One thing he wouldn't admit: the 4 murders. How do you ask forgiveness for something you say you didn't do? For 26 years, through every appeal, every hearing, every interview, Williams had maintained his innocence regarding the Owens and Yang murders. He acknowledged the Crips' body count. He acknowledged his role in creating the culture that killed hundreds, maybe thousands. But those 4 specific murders, the ones the jury convicted him of, the ones that put him on death row, he denied until death. That denial became the central question. The victims' families and prosecutors didn't ask whether Williams had changed. They asked whether he would confess, whether he would apologize for the murders. Not the gang in general. He wouldn't. He couldn't. To apologize would be to admit guilt for crimes he maintained he didn't commit. To confess to secure clemency would be to trade his claim of innocence for his life. Redemption required acknowledging all faults. His innocence claim required denying these specific faults. In Schwarzenegger's evaluation, the two became mutually exclusive. A person who genuinely transformed would apologize, the argument went. Williams' refusal suggested either he hadn't truly changed, or he was guilty and hiding it, or he was innocent and trapped in an impossible bind. No way to prove which. December 12, 2005 arrived, one day before the scheduled execution. The hearings were done. The arguments were made. The crowds had rallied. The victims' families had spoken. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat down and put his answer in writing. The decision was final. The answer emerged on paper. December 12, 2005, Sacramento. The press release began to print in the governor's office, pages emerging one by one, carrying Arnold Schwarzenegger's final decision. The statement opened with a question: is Stanley Williams' redemption complete and sincere, or is it a hollow promise? Schwarzenegger applied Williams' own standard. Williams had written that redemption requires acknowledging all faults, taking full responsibility for harm caused. The governor took that principle and measured Williams against it. Here was the tragic alignment they agreed on what redemption required. Williams had defined it himself in his books and memoir. Transformation begins with confession, with owning every wrong committed. Schwarzenegger accepted that definition. No dispute over philosophy. No disagreement about principles. The conflict came down to fact. One specific fact from 1979 that nobody alive could verify with certainty. Did Stanley Williams murder Albert Owens? Yen-Yi Yang, Sai-Sha Yang, and Yi Chen-Lin. A jury said yes in 1981. Williams said no for 26 years. The forensic evidence contained contradictions. Shoe prints that didn't match. Shotgun shells that didn't match the recovered weapon. Witnesses testified. Alibi witnesses testified. The jury believed one side. Schwarzenegger's statement acknowledged Williams' anti-gang work. The children's books. The thousands of young people potentially reached. The Nobel Peace Prize nominations. The memoir. The advocacy. All documented. All real. But the statement came back to the same point Williams had admitted founding the Crips, and acknowledged the devastation that followed. He had apologized for leading young people into gang life. He had expressed regret for the culture of violence he helped create. He had never apologized for the 4 murders. 6 words. I'm sorry for the murders. Never spoken in 26 years. The statement named the victims. Albert Owens by name, the security guard working a night shift at a 7-Eleven in Whittier. Then the 4 victims in this case, encompassing the Yang family murdered at the Brookhaven Motel. 4 human beings. 4 lives ended. Schwarzenegger's conclusion was direct. Without apology and atonement, there can be no redemption. The standard Williams had set for himself, he hadn't met according to the governor's evaluation. Not because Williams hadn't changed, not because the children's books were meaningless, but because redemption, by Williams' own definition, required acknowledging all faults, and he maintained his innocence regarding the specific crimes that had placed him on death row. The impossible bind held firm. To confess would mean abandoning his innocence claim. To maintain innocence meant he couldn't apologize for crimes he said he didn't commit. No resolution possible. If he was guilty, his refusal to confess suggested incomplete transformation. If he was innocent, his execution would be a 26-year injustice, ending in state-sanctioned murder. The truth resided in 1979, in moments only the dead and the convicted witnessed. No forensics could resolve it. No court had resolved it. The governor chose not to intervene. Clemency denied. The execution of Stanley Tookie Williams would proceed as scheduled December 13, 2005. 1 minute past midnight, the hours counted down. 1 minute past midnight approached December 13, 2005, San Quentin State Prison. The final moments measured in seconds. Outside. Hundreds of people stood in the cold holding candles. A vigil for a man most of them had never met. They held signs about redemption. They sang. They prayed. The temperature dropped as midnight neared, but they stayed. Inside. Stanley Williams walked from his death row cell to the execution chamber. The walk was short. The room was small. A gurney, restraints, witnesses behind glass. The exact outcome known before the door opened. 24 years on death row had led to this, A room measured in feet, a procedure measured in minutes. Williams walked without resistance. No struggle, no breakdown, no guards dragging him. He walked on his own. The same body that had once intimidated rivals on South Central streets, that had lifted weights in prison yards, that had become evidence in a murder trial, now walking toward an execution chamber voluntarily. The violence that had defined his youth, the reputation built on strength and intimidation, was gone. What replaced it was harder to define. Calm, dignity, acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion after 2.5 decades of appeals and waiting. Barbara Becknell, who had worked with Williams on the children's books, who had known him through the transformation years, watched. Later she would say, "We don't see the Tookies in the casket." The gang founder nickname, the street identity, the man who co-created the Crips, that person was already gone. "We see dignity," another observer asked. Who would do that without kicking and crying? Who walks that final walk without resistance? The question had. No easy answer. The victims' families chose silence. Their grief belongs to them, not to this story's need for closure. Somewhere in California. The families who had known Albert Owens were not interviewed that night. Somewhere. Those who remembered the Yang family, Yen E. Yang, Tai Shai Yang, Yi Chen Lin, were not asked for statements. The media focused on the crowds outside San Quentin, on the clemency debate, on Williams' transformation narrative. The families who had lived with loss for 26 years remained private. What they felt as the execution proceeded is not documented. Their grief is not public record. The story doesn't get to know. The execution proceeded according to protocol. Lethal injection. 3 chemicals administered in sequence. Witnesses watched through glass. Stanley Williams was pronounced dead at 12:35 a.m. December 13, 2005. 51 years old. Born December 1953 in Louisiana. Moved to Los Angeles as a child. Co-founded the Crips around 1971. Convicted of 4 murders in 1981. Sentenced to death. Spent 6 years in solitary confinement. Emerged transformed, or claiming transformation. Wrote 8 children's books warning against gang life. Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Denied clemency. Executed. All of it true. None of it canceling out the rest. 2 weeks later. Western Avenue in Los Angeles saw something the city had never witnessed before or since. 10,000 people came. The church doors opened on Western Avenue in late December 2005, near the streets where Stanley Williams grew up, and Los Angeles saw what it had never seen before. The church held 1,000. 1,000 more stood outside. Thousands of mourners gathered. Community members, supporters of Williams' anti-gang work, activists who had fought for clemency, people who had read his children's books, people who believed transformation was real. Louis Farrakhan spoke. Jesse Jackson spoke. They talked about redemption, about the possibility of change, about a system that executes people who might have become forces for good. Then the gang members arrived. Bloods and Crips, in full colors. Red and blue on the same street. The same colors that had marked territory for decades. That had signaled who to fight and who to trust. That had gotten thousands of young men killed across Los Angeles and beyond. They stood on Western Avenue together. No shots fired. No fights. No violence. Bloods and Crips stood together in full colors on the same street without violence. Something Stanley Williams couldn't achieve in life. granted for 1 day by his death. The man who co-founded the division that had torn through South Central for 30 years wasn't alive to see it pause. It only paused. The truce lasted 1 day. Then the colors went back to war. But for 1 day, at a funeral on Western Avenue, the impossible happened. Not because the problems were solved, not because the gang culture Williams helped create had been dismantled, but because enough people believed or wanted to believe that one man's transformation mattered, that redemption was possible, that death shouldn't be the only way out. The funeral ended. The crowds dispersed. Los Angeles returned to what it had been. Williams' anti-gang children's books remain in school libraries nationwide. Gangs and weapons. Gangs and self-esteem. Gangs and abuse of power. Teachers still assign them. Kids still read them. Some get the message and walk away from gang life. Impossible to count how many, but the books are there. The Crips remain in cities nationwide. Thousands of members. Decades of violence continuing. The gang Williams co-founded around 1971 didn't end with his execution in 2005. It's still there, still recruiting, still claiming lives. Both legacies continue. Parallel. Unresolved. The gang founder and the anti-gang advocate. The same person. Both impacts real, neither canceling the other. Williams' case became a reference point in every death penalty debate that followed, not because it provides clear answers, but because it's unclear at exactly the hardest places. Can people genuinely transform? Does redemption require confession? What do we owe victims versus the convicted? How do we measure a life that contains multiple truths? Stanley Williams, gang founder, convicted killer, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, children's author, executed man. All of it true simultaneously, none of it canceling the rest. But 4 people died in 1979. Albert Owens, 26 years old, working a night shift at a 7-Eleven in Whittier. Yen E. Yang, Tai Shai Yang, Yi Chen Lin, a family, murdered in their motel room for less than $100. This is what we know about them. This is what we know. Albert Owens worked the night shift at a 7-Eleven in Whittier, lay down when told to, and compliance didn't save him. That is nearly all the history kept. A young man working to support himself, doing everything the gunman asked, executed anyway. February 1979. The Yang family owned a motel on Vermont Avenue with a 6-deadbolt door. Someone kicked through all 6 locks. Took $50 to $100. And left 3 people dead. Yen E. Yang, Tai Shai Yang, Yi Chen Lin, March 1979. We have their full names. They exist in court records, police reports, trial transcripts. But in 26 years of retellings, articles, documentaries, clemency debates, books about Stanley Williams, almost nobody mentioned them. The victims were erased, not by absence of information, but by indifference. The story became about the gang founder, the transformation, the Nobel nomination, the execution. The 4 who died became footnotes. The Yang family had a daughter who survived. She would be in her 50s now. We don't know her name, so we can't say what she might have become, what she made of the decades her family didn't get. Did Stanley Williams murder those 4 people? 12 jurors heard the evidence in 1981 and said yes. Williams said no for 26 years, with his life at stake, and never changed his answer. The people who could settle it with certainty were killed in 1979. There is no version of this story where we find out. 6 words. I'm sorry. I did it. 26 years. Never spoken. Barbara Becknell continues the anti-gang work that began in San Quentin visiting rooms. The 8 children's books remain on school library shelves across the country, bearing the name of a man California executed. Teachers still assign them. Kids still read warnings about gang life written by someone who helped create it. The Crips are still here, decades after Williams' execution. The gang he co-founded continues, both legacies, parallel, unresolved. Williams only had to say one sentence to have a chance at life. 6 words. I'm sorry. I did it. Confess to the murders. Apologize to the families. Acknowledge the harm. He never said them. Maybe it was a lie he refused to speak, maintaining innocence because he was innocent. Maybe it was a truth he couldn't carry, guilt he wouldn't confess, even to save his own life. We will never know which. And that is the sentence Stanley Williams left to the rest of us. Not resolution, not clarity, the permanent weight of not knowing. Stanley Williams left 2 legacy books warning children away from gangs, and the gang itself still claiming lives. He left one question no one can answer: guilt or innocence. He left 4 victims whose names should have been spoken more. Albert Owens. 26. Restocking cigarettes on a February night in Whittier. Doing everything right. Yen E. Yang. Tsai Shai Yang. Yi Chen Lin. A family behind 6 locks that didn't hold. 4 people who were alive in 1979 and then weren't. Their deaths are not metaphor. Their names are not symbols. They were people, and they're gone. And we owe them at least this, to be remembered not as footnotes to someone else's story, but as the story itself. That is where the story ends, not with answers, but with questions that remain. Albert Owens. Yen E. Yang. Tsai Shai Yang. Yi Chen Lin. 4 names that should have been spoken first, but instead became footnotes to a debate about transformation and justice. Their families carried decades of grief, while the world argued about whether a convicted man had truly changed. This case asks questions we cannot answer. Did Stanley Williams commit those murders? 12 jurors said yes. He said no until his final breath. The people who could tell us for certain were killed in 1979. What we know is this: 4 people died, and their stories deserve to be told. Redemption is complicated. Justice is imperfect.
It was a husband and wife and a daughter that was killed, and then left with about $50 to $100.
If this story made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe people can truly change? Should redemption require confession? What do we owe the victims when answers remain unclear? Please subscribe if you want more stories like this. True crime that asks you to think deeply about justice, mercy, and the human capacity for both violence and change. Thank you for listening with the respect this story deserves.
Superman don't exist.
This narrative is based on a real case: the 1979 murders of Albert Owens and the Yang family, the conviction of Stanley Williams, and his 2005 execution. Some scenes have been dramatized for storytelling, but the core facts and unanswered questions are real.
I told people years ago, we don't see took you to the casket.
Our deepest respect to the victims' families who have carried this grief for decades.
There was a gang truce for the day going on, so you had like all these Bloods and Crips on Western.